Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is State Pollinator-Friendly Solar Initiatives. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. We have a number of excellent guest speakers with us today, and we will get to them in just a moment, but first I would like to go through a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can call in using a telephone, or you can connect using your computer, mic, and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled there. You can also click on that to expand the webinar console. And one thing that I'd like to make sure you know how to do with your webinar console is to submit questions and comments. You can do that in the questions box that you see circled. Type those in and hit send. We will save some time at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the audience. We want to get to as many questions as we can. We do have a lot of people registered today, so to make sure that we get to all the questions we can, please type those questions in when you think of them. Don't wait until the very end. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the slides following the webinar. And we'll also be posting those on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So you can find those webinar materials there, and that's also a good place to find information about our upcoming webinars. So with that, I would like to pass it over now to our host for today's webinar, Nate Hausman. Nate is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he is going to get us started. Over to you, Nate.
Great, thanks, Samantha. Sure enough, I am Nate Hausman, a project director at the Clean Energy States Alliance. And before we get underway, I just want to say I hope that that everybody is healthy and well, and your families too. Before getting underway into the substance of the presentation today, I just want to give you a quick note about the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CESA. We are a national nonprofit coalition of public agencies and organizations. We work together to advance clean energy. CESA is mostly comprised of state-level agencies. You can see our members on this slide, the logos. And today's webinar is about an exciting topic, state pollinator-friendly solar initiatives. So the way we're going to do it is first we'll hear overviews from Georgena Terry and Rob Davis about what's happening on this topic from around the country. And then we're going to dive into some state-specific pollinator-friendly solar programs. So we've set aside an hour and a half for the webinar, and we'll be sure to leave time at the end for questions. So type those into the box, the console box, as we go. In the interest of time, I'll introduce all of our panelists at the outset now, and then I'll turn it over to them. So with that, Georgena Terry is a volunteer research associate for the Clean Energy States Alliance. She's the founder of Terry Precision Bicycles for Women. Her interest in environmental issues arose from many miles on a bicycle, following roads along marshes and grasslands and through forests. This burgeoning passion eventually led her to Vermont Law School, where she earned a Master's of Environmental Law and Policy. She also has a Bachelor's of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Carnegie Mellon University and an MBA from the Wharton School. And then next up will be Rob Davis. Rob Davis serves as director of the Center for Pollinators in Energy at Fresh Energy. Rob helps accelerate the nation's transition to use of clean and renewable energy. Rob's work on pollinator-friendly solar has been featured in trainings by the U.S. Department of Interior's National Conservation Training Center and the U.S. Department of Energy in featured stories in Fast Company, Solar Power, and Solar Builder magazines. Previously, Rob helped launch technology startups and created the international crowdsourced campaign that launched Firefox web browser. And following Rob's presentation will be Rene Hypes. Rene currently serves as the Virginia Natural Heritage Environmental Review Coordinator and has been in this position for 20 years. Her job involves reviewing and assessing impacts to natural heritage resources, rare plants and animals, significant communities and karst from various projects throughout the state, including solar development. Prior to that, she worked for the Department of Environmental Quality as a water protection permit writer and taught high school biology for 11 years. Rene received her BA in Education from Shepherd College and her MS in Environmental Science from Virginia Commonwealth University. Following that will be Ben Inskeep, and Ben is a principal analyst at EQ Research, a national clean energy consulting firm. Ben lives in Indiana and works on state-level renewable and distributed energy policy issues from across the country. His focus currently includes community source energy programs in California, Midwest energy policy, and utility resource planning and rate making. Prior to joining EQ Research, Ben provided research and technical assistance to local governments on solar issues under a DOE grant and contributed to the National Desire Clean Energy Policy database at NC State. And then finally, we'll hear from Dan Shaw. Dan is a senior ecologist and vegetation specialist for the Minnesota Board of Water Resources, where he coordinates conservation programs focused on native vegetation establishment, invasive species management, pollinator habitat-friendly solar, water management, and resiliency to climate change. He also taught ecology courses at the University of Minnesota for the past 18 years and has written and illustrated several ecology-focused publications. So with those introductions out of the way, we'll start off with Georgena. Georgena, the platform is yours. Take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Nate. And thanks so much to everyone for attending today. I'm going to briefly go over the high points of my white paper on pollinator-friendly solar initiatives to set the stage for the remainder of this webinar. The role of pollinators is critical to maintaining agricultural production. Conservative estimates are that about a quarter of this production depends on pollinators, but I've also seen other estimates that are as high as 3/4. And 90% of flowering plant species need pollinators to set seed and fruit. The most important pollinator is the bee, although butterflies, beetles, and flies are also pollinators. Bee populations have declined by as much as 30% annually. To compound the problem, many bee species are extinct or are at risk of extinction. Habitat loss is the primary reason for this pollinator decline. Rethinking the habitat under ground-mounted solar arrays offers an opportunity for protection of pollinators. Ground-mounted solar arrays are estimated to occupy about 350,000 acres of land in the United States, so the potential for habitat protection is significant. It's not unusual to strip vegetation from under ground-mounted solar arrays and replace it with gravel or turf grass, which is mowed frequently and treated with herbicides. It's always been assumed that this treatment of the land reduces maintenance costs. But imagine cultivating vegetation under these arrays, and then you have the heart of pollinator-friendly solar. Planting appropriate native grasses and wildflowers under solar arrays can attract pollinators. In addition, these plantings require less maintenance and mowing than traditional treatments. They have the added benefit of decreasing the temperature under the panels, creating a microclimate of sorts, which increases panel efficiency. That is, more electricity can be produced. In addition, when pollinator-dependent crops like soy or specialty crops are grown near these treated, I should say untreated, but pollinator-friendly solar arrays, those crops may experience enhanced production from these solar pollinator plantings. States have begun to recognize the benefits of pollinator-friendly solar and have passed legislation that allows solar projects to claim that they're pollinator-friendly if they adhere to certain guidelines. Most guidelines use a scorecard to determine site qualifications. The scorecards usually developed by academia, a Department of Natural Resources, or a combination of those. And note that this is a voluntary designation. It's not required of solar projects. In addition to protecting the environment, solar sites that are pollinator-friendly have a marketing advantage over those that are not. Think positive branding for an idea of how that works. They have an efficiency advantage by virtue of the cooler operating environment and reduced maintenance costs, just to name a few things. These legislative initiatives can almost be described as feel-good initiatives. They have very few detractors and they appeal to both sides of the aisle. I'd like to discuss some of these state actions that have been taken. So far, 7 states have taken action, and 1 is pending right now in Kansas. The Solar Pollinator Habitat Act is currently under discussion in their legislation there. I have to say that Minnesota is really the granddaddy of all the states when it comes to pollinator-friendly solar. It was the first state to address pollinator protection in 2013 with a law establishing a pollinator habitat program and scorecard to develop best management practices and guidelines for pollinator habitat enhancement. In 2016, the legislature followed up by addressing pollinator-friendly solar sites directly. Things were quiet until 2017, and then Maryland introduced a pollinator-friendly designation. South Carolina, Vermont, New York, and Illinois followed rapidly in 2018 with their own pollinator-friendly solar acts. Michigan, in 2019, amended its farmland open space preservation program. Those amendments permit solar facilities to be erected on lands which are enrolled in the open space preservation program. Landowners whose property is used for siting solar may be eligible for certain exemptions if the land complies with Michigan's pollinator habitat planning scoreboard for solar sites. Now, there are other ways that states can promote pollinator-friendly solar. States are considered to be authorities on energy and environmental matters, and they're active on both fronts. So it makes sense that they would have a vested interest in pollinator protection for ecological conservation and agricultural productivity. They can encourage their municipalities to consider pollinator habitats in their solar permitting processes. They can also provide educational materials on the importance of pollinators, which are targeted to solar developers, farmers, or the general public. And state agencies can take proactive roles in encouraging pollinator-friendly solar development. For instance, in Virginia, the Department of Environmental Quality and the Department of Conservation and Recreation have developed a Pollinator-Smart program, which advises solar developers on pollinator-friendly habitat. State agencies may also participate as board members in academia's pollinator research. The North Carolina Department of Agriculture and the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality are members of the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance, which has developed a technical guidance document for native plantings on solar sites. And similar activities have occurred between the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture and Penn State Center for Pollinator Research. That concludes this brief overview of this white paper. You can download the complete paper on CESA's site. If you don't scribble down the URL right now, don't worry about it, because as Nate said, we'll be sending everybody a link to these slides. In conclusion, if you have any questions or comments on my white paper, please feel free to contact me. And once again, thank you all very much for coming this afternoon.
Great, thanks, Georgena. Let's pass it over to Rob Davis. Rob, the platform's yours.
Thanks so much, Nate. Thank you, Georgena. It's just been an absolute pleasure getting to know you and collaborate with the whole team at the Clean Energy States Alliance. I'm in such admiration of the great work that you all are doing, and it is so important. It's great to have something that is so hopeful and positive to talk about today. So I'll talk a little bit about the trends nationwide in pollinator-friendly solar, as well as the implications for broader engagement, and for all the folks thinking about solar right now, coming to their communities, how they can ensure that they stack the most benefits. And Samantha, if you could advance me to the next slide. It looks like my web browser has decided to choke up on me. So
Samantha, we're still seeing Georgena's closeout slide.
I'm sorry, that was
There we
my
go.
fault. I had it paused there. Sorry about that.
There we go. It's all right.
You
So
should be able to advance it now.
great, thank you. So as I think we all know, when people are presented with the opportunity to get something that's better and cheaper, that they generally lean forward and are very enthusiastic about that opportunity. And that's, I'm grateful to the research done by the National Renewable Energy Lab in advancing solar technology and all of the different costs associated with solar PV solar development, because it's taken solar from costs that only the military and NASA can afford to put satellites in space back in the 60s and 70s, to now, you know, it's just absolutely the lowest cost resource in, I believe, more than 2/3 of the states in the country. So cheaper and better is winning. However, I think something that's unanticipated that we're finding is that there's a lot of photovoltaic PV solar designs that have been kind of left over from development in the desert Southwest. So as solar started there, these designs have just been moved to other states and adapted to other states, but they're still calling for, you know, removing the topsoil, potentially treating the site like it's a substation or some other very hazardous and industrial land use. So you can see some designs here that actually truck in, you know, thousands and thousands of tons of gravel or crushed white rock, and just outside the fence, there's clearly arable land. So this is a trade-off that more and more communities are wrestling with, because I think, you know, when we all think about the clean, green energy transition, we would really like to avoid negative trade-offs. We'd really like to ensure that the land under and around the panels is benefiting us just as much as the clean energy is. And so we at Fresh Energy, we're an energy policy nonprofit that shapes and drives the energy conversation. And so we heard from some of our colleagues and supporters in Minnesota about how solar projects can cause tension when they're built with these kinds of designs that use gravel or bare ground. And we leaned forward back in 2015 and started doing some research, and found a picture of this solar project, the West Mill Solar Park. I think I had Googled biodiversity and solar and found this great work by the ecologist Guy Parker on a beautiful solar facility there. And certainly, you know, us here in the Midwest and in Minnesota, we know a thing or two about prairie. It used to be that we would mostly just dig prairie up and convert it into, you know, acres and acres of corn and beans. But we certainly have a great deal of expertise in reestablishing fields of flowering meadows that can thrive in these communities. However, the key thing that we identified as a concern is this question of, well, what does pollinator friendly really mean? You know, are we talking about replacing every blade of grass with a flower? Because that would likely increase cost to such an extent that it would threaten the finances of the solar projects. What is really appropriate within the context of a solar array? We can't have shading of the panels. There must be a way to do this that has some degree of performance and basically meets the operating constraints of the solar facility. So we knew that if there was misaligned incentives, if there wasn't a fair and flexible science-based definition as to what constitutes pollinator friendly, then, you know, some bad actors might say, oh, well, this is fine. I can just get a couple of potted plants, stick them in the corner of my solar facility, or maybe put them right by the front door, and get the picture in just the right place, and it looks like the whole thing. We could have, you know, just a little tiny bit of pollinator habitat. So we wanted to make sure that this was done well, and it was done in a way that didn't disrupt the finances of the solar projects. And so that's how we stumbled upon a tool called the Pollinator-Friendly Solar Scorecard. It was, again, a flexible and science-based way to ensure that there was a balance between what's reasonable to expect and what's actually implementable. And we know that it makes a difference in the science, and we know that it makes a difference for the bees because our first call was to this woman, Dr. Marla Spivak, who's a MacArthur Genius Award-winning honeybee scientist, and her colleague at the time, Dr. Karen Oberhauser, one of the world's most respected monarch experts. And they advised us and worked with us because they were very clear that most municipal governments, state governments, and the federal government simply aren't investing enough in habitat and in conservation to keep these species alive. So we urgently need to unlock the opportunity for private sector investment in quality habitat. And that came into the form of this tool that was maintained by the Board of Water and Soil Resources. They already had a couple of scorecards that they used, and were able to solicit input and expertise from the University of Minnesota and Xerxes and Audubon and other key constituencies, and publish a pollinator-friendly solar scorecard, which we then worked with agricultural and conservation allies to pass unanimously into law back in 2016. That was the Pollinator-Friendly Solar Act of 2016. And so the scorecards are an incremental change in a seed mix to provide a meaningful benefit for pollinators. It's not about putting 1 acre in front of a 1,000-acre solar farm. It's about changing the seed mix 1 to 5 to 10% in the open area mix and the array area mix to provide a meaningful benefit at scale. And we know that it works. So we have projects now in state after state after state, helping people understand that this is implementable, this is doable on small projects like this one in Vermont. This is doable on very, very large projects like this 150 megawatt site project owned by Enel Green Power. This is doable throughout to appeal to different kinds of pollinators, whether it's honeybees or monarchs. And it makes a real difference in the way that people perceive and respond to solar. When a site starts looking like this, and just within a year or 14 months can look like this and like this, it really helps local constituencies understand that this isn't a big, scary new land use. This is an extraordinary opportunity to unlock agricultural innovation and energy innovation to get better water quality outcomes, better soil carbon sequestration outcomes, and establish thousands and thousands of acres of habitat. So as Georgena mentioned, we have around 350,000 acres of ground mount solar today. By 2030, the National Renewable Energy Lab forecast will have roughly 3 million to 4 million acres. So there's Denison University and then University of Dayton before and after. These projects have just so much charisma. They're so beautiful. Connexus Energy is a real innovator and leader on this. They had one of the first pollinator-friendly solar arrays in the country. Pine Gate Renewables out in Oregon has some great sites out there. This is at a wastewater treatment facility in Maryland. Communities just absolutely love this. Down in Plains, Georgia, President Carter had his solar farm reseeded to be pollinator friendly. We're excited to start seeing flowering vegetation on that project next spring. And this isn't just about small projects or small companies. This is also global energy companies, including Enel Green Power and ENGIE. They've looked at this approach and they're doing it at scale in a way that is exciting, meeting these standards. Other developers listed here are also embracing this approach. So there's lots of competition. So companies that are proposing gravel or bare ground solar projects to municipalities sometimes feel pressure that they need to, they want the tax revenue and they should just say yes. They should all know that there are more and more projects that are being developed that are pollinator friendly. And so there's competition in this market. Blockbuster was great for a few years and we're doing something better now. So there's competition in the market. Utilities are making pledges, in fact. This is at a Pheasant Fest, a national gathering of pheasant hunters, like roughly 20,000 pheasant hunters. Connexus Energy, Excel Energy, Southern Municipal Power, all pledged to ask for a pollinator-friendly solar scorecard as part of their energy procurement. MCE, Clean Energy out in California, is now requiring it, and Alliant Energy and Dairyland Power both have a number of pollinator-friendly solar farms in their generation portfolio. So utilities love this. And why not? If you ask for it, then your bids and the projects you'll see will reflect it. Universities are asking for pollinator-friendly solar. Again, they're putting it in their RFPs. And corporations, of course, companies like Cliff Bar and Organic Valley, and in Pennsylvania, Giant, are developing pollinator-friendly solar farms. They want not just the clean energy benefits, they want the connection to the food system and the connection to saving the pollinators at scale. And it's not just the pollinators, it's also additional opportunity for carbon sequestration, and all of the root systems that break down on these sites give the soil more moisture holding capacity. So we're also working with the National Renewable Energy Lab. They are vetting this as a best practice, and they've been working on it and doing research on these projects for coming up on 5-6 years now. And as Georgena mentioned, this is a huge opportunity. We are in a warming world, and the reality is that solar panels degrade in efficiency by about 0.5% for every 1 degree Celsius above 77, for every roughly 2 degrees Fahrenheit for every degree above 77 Fahrenheit. Let's include it in the slide here. So because we live in a warming world, we need to be aware of how to mitigate the negative effects of heat. And doing ground cover that's pea gravel or crushed rock is going to create a heat island effect. So thicker vegetation helps you mitigate the negative effects of heat and keep your solar farm operating at a peak temperature. The key questions that often come up are, is there a fire risk? No, these are actually cooler. Is there an OSHA appeal? You can solve these. These are all questions that we've been vetting and answering again and again and again for the last 5 years. And there's so many benefits, as you can see on the left, from community support to soil benefits, the resilient landscaping, to the brand and the PR benefits, and then the performance. So this is a project that is ready to go, it's ready to scale, and it's ready for more and more municipalities to ask for it. Conservation grazing is absolutely compatible as well. So sheep grazing can be done in a way that's not compatible. That's called continuous grazing. And so as long as there's conservation grazing, the sheep are out there, they're moving around the solar project, and they're helping to improve the quality of the habitat. And this is a practice that's recommended by the American Solar Grazing Association as well. So once you have a pollinator-friendly solar array as well, the things that open to you really start to get fun, because these are opportunities to locate a honeybee hive nearby. And then once you have honey, of course, this is just a delicious way to help your community, help your partners, help your constituents and key audiences connect with what the taste of clean energy is. Beekeepers love having acres of flowering meadows that are free of neonicotinoid pesticides, solar grown honey, as we have here with the Department of Agriculture Commissioner opening the first beef frame of honey from the 2019 harvest. And then that is an ingredient that didn't just go into delicious jars. This is fair honey that beekeepers here harvesting off of a site in Iowa and Minnesota, and then packaging it up for Cliff Family as a product that they're selling on their website. And then the natural evolution, of course, is to take that honey and use it in a beer. So there's some ideas here that get pretty wild, but as you can see, by a simple step of embracing pollinator-friendly solar, it creates opportunities not just to benefit the soil, the water, the pollinators, but it creates an opportunity for food producers, brewers, beekeepers to really innovate with that as a landscape. So I'm glad to be part of the conversation today, and I appreciate your time.
Great, thanks, Rob. Let's move into some state-specific approaches, and let's start with Rene in Virginia. Rene?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rene Hypes, and I work for the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, Division of Natural Heritage. And thank you for the opportunity to present information on the Virginia Pollinator-Smart program today. Solar development has increased significantly over the last several years in the Commonwealth. In 2012, the Department of Environmental Quality developed a permit by rule for permitting solar projects. As shown on the slide, you can see that since 2015, DEQ has issued 45 permits for projects over 5 megawatts, impacting almost 25,000 acres. An additional 62 projects have been proposed, totaling over 36,000 acres. This is a current map from the DEQ Renewable Energy website, displaying renewable energy projects, including solar projects throughout Virginia. As you can see, these projects are at various stages of development, some issuing a notice of intent to others being permitted and producing power. The flag you see on the map represents a wind energy permanent project yet to be constructed. Another incentive for solar development in Virginia is the governor's executive order for clean energy goals, including 30% of Virginia's electric system being powered by renewables by 2030 and 100% of electricity by carbon-free sources by 2050. With the coming of age of the solar industry in Virginia and the momentum building nationwide to combine green renewable energy with other environmental benefits, including reduced soil and water runoff, the capture of atmospheric carbon, and the establishment of pollinator habitat on these solar sites. To encourage solar developers and operators to consider this ecologically responsible approach, in 2019, DEQ and the Department of Conservation and Recreation teamed up with other experts to establish a Pollinator-Smart program for Virginia. As you can see from the slide, the Pollinator-Smart team was formed among leading experts in the field, and I'm here today representing the team's work. The Virginia Pollinator webpage is currently the portal for accessing the various resource pollinator tools. Each megawatt of solar development in the avian protection zone within the coastal zone of Virginia equated to a $1,000 donation to research funds for potential avian impacts from solar development. This funding supported the development of the Virginia Pollinator-Smart program for encouraging the establishment of pollinator and bird habitat on these facilities. The voluntary program allows developers to assess their proposed project, including the planting plan and other ecological assets of the facility, using a scorecard to determine if they're meeting Pollinator-Smart criteria to benefit pollinators. In our efforts not to reinvent the wheel, the Virginia scorecards were based on other state scorecards. There are actually 2 versions of the Virginia scorecard for different scenarios. The blue scorecard you see here is for new solar facilities planned as Pollinator-Smart sites, or existing solar facilities planned to be retrofitted as Pollinator-Smart sites. Solar sites that meet the minimum requirement of 80 points on the scorecard are considered certified Virginia Pollinator-Smart. Those that score over 100 points are considered gold certified Virginia Pollinator-Smart. The green scorecard is for established solar facilities already approved as Pollinator-Smart sites and being monitored for continued compliance with the Pollinator-Smart program. The comprehensive manual provides guidance on how to establish pollinator and bird habitat, from the initial site suitability analysis to the long-term management plan. This slide provides a snapshot of the steps involved in getting a solar site certified and keeping it certified through this program. For instance, year 1 is the planning and implementing stage of the program, including site suitability analysis, pollinator planting design with vegetation management plans. The scorecard, along with accompanying materials, is submitted to a review board made up of state, agencies, and academia for assessment and certification concurrence prior to installation. Years 2 through 9 include biennial monitoring using the green scorecard with remediation as needed to maintain certification status. Per the monitoring plan, the reporting requirements are minimal and include the following baseline components: an executive summary, a site map, vegetative, data tables, representative photos, and site management documentation. In year 10, the focus includes a long-term management plan, and again, remediation if necessary, knowing thinking about invasive species management. And is an incentive for developers. If the site maintains Pollinator-Smart certification for 10 years, the site is considered certified for the lifespan of the project via approval from the review board. One of the resources enhanced last year by the team was the Solar Site Native Plant Finder. The tool is designed to aid solar site developers providing a database of native plant species that are commercially available. The database contains information useful in designing a high-quality habitat for pollinators, birds, beneficial insect predators, and wildlife. The application is based on the flora of Virginia and currently includes approximately 1,600 species, with 278 native plants commercially available. In addition, it allows you to query for native species using characteristics such as light and water requirements, maximum height, and location. The query results provide species information including habitat, links to photos, and commercial vendors. This is a screen capture of the interface of the application, allowing a query to be conducted via scientific or common name to search for a particular plant species. Other plant characteristics can be queried by other attributes such as full sun, partial sun shade, water requirements, type of plant, herb, grass, rush, or sedge, as well as trees for those screening areas of the solar facility. As you can see, query results display all of the attributes searched for, including links to the digital Atlas of Virginia Flora and hyperlinks to the vendors that have the native seeds commercially available. As a vital part of the Virginia Pollinator-Smart program, a business plan was developed by the team identifying an overall goal of starting up a native seed industry in Virginia. The idea was to form a Virginia native seed growers business advisory committee that would provide support to the local Virginia growers through marketing, mentorship, and financial support. The committee will help identify growers for the program and provide the seed. Shared infrastructure, including seeding and harvesting equipment, would also be available to farmers in the program for help in planting and harvesting of the native seeds. Once seeds are harvested, they would be able to send them to a commercial facility for processing and distribution. As part of the Virginia's Native Seed Growers Business Advisory Committee, a Virginia ecotype group would be in charge of the collection, grow out, and certification of the native Virginia ecotype seed. There are other states that currently have a successful seed program, including the Arkansas Native Seed Program. This program, established by the Arkansas Native Heritage Commission, has partnered with a dozen agencies and nonprofits, including Audubon, Arkansas, to seek out and work with farmers willing to grow wildflowers and grasses to produce large quantities of locally sourced native seed for use in wildlife and restoration projects. This concept is similar to what is being proposed for Virginia, basically providing 2 or 3 species of native seed to local farmers and having them grow out on that seed on 2 or so acres of land. The harvested material is then shipped to Roundstone, a native seed facility in Kentucky, for processing and distribution. Another successful program is the Iowa Ecotype Project, whereas its mandate is to develop seed of the highest possible quality with the greatest genetic diversity, with the intention of restoring the great vast prairie land of Iowa. The program started in 1990 and as of 2011 has over 800 acres in production. Over its history, it increased seeds of 50 species from 3,000 populations throughout Iowa. There are 81 Iowa ecotypes of 33 species released annually. So this idea of planting native species, including pollinator species, can be applied far beyond solar facilities. For instance, brownfields, including reclaimed mine sites and Superfund sites, could be great candidates for revegetating the sites with native pollinator species. The Atlantic Coast Pipeline and Mountain Valley Pipeline, working in consultation with DCR and others, have developed seed mixes to include native plant species in their maintained right-of-ways. In addition, transmission line projects due to open canopy and maintained right-of-ways provide suitable habitat for the planting of native pollinator species. The Virginia Department of Transportation and the Blue Ridge Prison Group have worked along with DCR to consider the planting of native species within their right-of-ways. Also, the removal of invasive species from their seed mixes and potential funding of resources to determine what native species are the most suitable for Virginia's roadside right-of-ways. VDOT has also established native pollinator areas at some of their rest stops. The Interagency Wetland Mitigation Banking Team has discussed the potential use of native pollinator species of many of the proposed banks. Native pollinator species can be the future crop for some farmers. Parks and schools and landowners have opportunities to consider the planting of native plant pollinators as part of their landscaping plans. Research has shown as little as a half an acre of pollinator habitat can be beneficial for pollinators. As a matter of fact, Virginia's first Pollinator-Smart Gold certified solar site is the Copel Elementary School in Westmoreland County. The ground-mounted solar system designed by Sun Tribe at the school meets 100% of the school's energy needs and will save Westmoreland County Public Schools an estimated $3.6 million in energy costs. The height of the system's 2,100 panels will allow native pollinator-friendly species to be planted under the array, while it is also designed to consider other factors including seed mix, grass diversity, educational collaboration opportunities, and vegetation management plans. For more information on the Virginia Pollinator-Smart program, please visit our website or email us. Thank you.
Thank you, Rene. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ben Inskeep in Indiana. Ben?
Thanks much. My name is Ben. I am a Hoosier based in Indianapolis, Indiana. I work on clean energy policy at the consulting firm EQ Research. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about a new report that we did in consultation and in collaboration with the Center for Pollinators and Energy at Fresh Energy. And the focus of this report is on Indiana specifically, but it does have a lot of applications beyond our state. So to back up just a little bit, I think Indiana is coming to this issue from a different place than other states, such as Virginia and Minnesota, that are going to be featured also today in our discussion. So I think our example is going to be a nice complement to those states. To date, we have installed about 400 megawatts of solar in Indiana. So we're not at the top of the list in terms of states that have installed the most solar. Right now, most of our electricity generation is coming through coal plants. And moreover, recently, siting of large renewable energy projects has been a key issue that has faced some pushback in some of our communities and faced various challenges to local ordinances and siting requirements. So that has been a kind of a contentious issue in some places, and something that we're looking, towards the future here in terms of what are the major issues, and that's going to be one of them that we're looking to address. And that's why pollinator-friendly practices are particularly exciting to me. These types of practices that can enhance a project's aesthetics, create positive environmental impacts, and maintain the viability of a site for future agricultural use. These could all be useful tools to helping build community support, particularly in a state like Indiana. So today we published a new report on pollinator-friendly solar in Indiana. Like I said, this was a collaboration with our friends at Fresh Energy. And the goal of this report is to, not only discuss what's happening in other states and provide examples, but also provide some model ordinances, model RFP provisions, and other examples of state scorecards that are in use around the country, and discuss how we can apply them to a state like Indiana that is, emerging as a state in the 2020s that's going to be having potentially a lot of solar installed. So we're using a lot of the great work that has been done by folks on this webinar and elsewhere. Specifically, Fresh Energy has been a leader on this. We also used built on CESA's report on this issue that was released earlier this year, and research by EPRI and others who have looked at this issue in a number of states. In Indiana, we had a great technical guide released earlier this year by the Michiana Area Council of Governments. And this technical guide describes the maintenance and establishment of pollinator-friendly solar projects in northern Indiana, and has specific technical guidance for the conditions in that area. So that was adapted from some of the great leading work by Minnesota to create technical guidance, and we're looking forward to this kind of guidance being expanded to cover the whole state of Indiana. And moreover, we're seeing other folks work on this issue here as well. Notably, the Purdue University Extension is creating a solar pollinator scorecard for the state of Indiana. So as somebody that went to Indiana University, I'm reluctant to give Purdue University credit for anything, but in this case, they're doing great work. So props to them for that. So let's discuss the Indiana context briefly here, just a little bit more. Right now, Indiana has, mostly coal plants. We have, I think, something around 17,000 megawatts of coal plants, but we are on the cusp of a major energy transition here. More than 10,000 megawatts of coal is anticipated to be retired within the next 15 years in our state, as is shown on this map on the slide. And so in the next decade, our 5 investor-owned utilities are going to need to replace a lot of that generation with alternative sources. And solar has definitely emerged in the past couple of years as one of the primary resources that utilities are looking to invest in, given the significant cost declines that this technology has experienced. So just these 5 utilities are expected to install more than 6,000 megawatts of solar in our state in the next decade. And that doesn't even include our electric cooperatives, our municipal utilities, and other folks that might be interested in investing in large-scale renewable energy. So I think it's also important to point out we are, a big agricultural state, but even if all this solar was sited on prime farmland in the state, it would leave more than 99% of our prime farmland for agricultural use. So it's not something that we're anticipating in the next decade to be a major factor in the loss of farmland or the removal of our prime farmland for this use. And so given this kind of major solar boom we're expecting, and along with the retirement of coal plants in the coming years, now is an ideal time for a state like Indiana to examine its solar siting and permitting policies and to prepare for this, what we're calculating to be a 1,600% increase in our solar over the next decade. So now is really the time to examine these policies and to figure out how we can make this transition as environmentally beneficial as possible. So we've already heard some of the great benefits that pollinator-friendly solar policies can incentivize and can result in from our previous speakers. So I'm not going to discuss each of these, but I did want to highlight a couple of the benefits specific to the Indiana context that I think are particularly noteworthy. First is that land use issue. Solar is expected to impact less than 1% of our farmland over the next decade. So it's important to know that this issue is often, one that's, overstated or overhyped as in terms of being a major concern for the loss of our prime agricultural farmland. However, pollinator-friendly practices can mean that upon decommissioning of a solar facility, the land can more easily be returned to prior uses. So pollinator-friendly practices can increase the organic matter in soil and water holding capabilities of soil, and also improve and maintain the agricultural potential of the land. In addition, in terms of environmental benefits of these policies, one of the major environmental problems that we have in our state is things like stormwater runoff, which can result in the loss of valuable topsoil and nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen. And those nutrients can, when they enter the waterways, can lead to serious environmental problems. So things like eutrophication and dead zones downstream. And so this is another reason why native species at solar sites are, a great policy to consider, is because they can improve that soil quality and water absorption, and help mitigate some of these impacts that we see. So our report is, provides a kind of a detailed look at various policies that are in place around the country, with a kind of a focus on Midwest examples that we've seen so far to encourage pollinator-friendly practices at solar sites. As we've heard, the state scorecard is really the foundational tool that's in place right now, that really opens the door to a lot of additional policies that build on that. So as a reminder, we've heard that these pollinator habitat assessment scorecards allow a solar site to earn a voluntary designation that the site is pollinator friendly. And so, a site can look at the best practices that are depicted in these cards, and really allows them flexibility to determine what works at their site, and to provide both certainty as well as flexibility in determining how they can meet a pollinator-friendly designation. The report also looks at model and example ordinances from various places that have focused on encouraging pollinator-friendly practices at solar sites. So I think that's another key area, is that particularly once the scorecard is developed, it opens the door for local governments to encourage or require even solar to adhere to those standards to meet the voluntary designation, or otherwise to benefit from the positive aspects of having that voluntary designation. Another exciting opportunity is through RFP provisions. So that's a request for proposals. So our report also provides kind of a model language that utilities or other entities that are procuring renewable energy through a competitive solicitation, so they can incorporate within that RFP to encourage solar projects to adopt pollinator-friendly practices. So, for example, through the bid scoring protocols and that, they can, specifically call attention to these practices and encourage it that way. And then the report also, mentions several other policies in states like Michigan and Massachusetts that have found, additional ways to incentivize sound management practices at solar sites that include things like pollinator-friendly provisions. So in Massachusetts, they have an actual financial incentive under their SMART program that will allow solar sites to earn an additional incentive that meet these criteria. And in Michigan, they have a policy related to their farmland, in allowing farmland that's participating in a program that earns a tax credit to continue to earn that tax credit, even if they develop a portion of that farmland for a solar site that is pollinator friendly. Moving on to the recommendations. again, while these recommendations kind of are specific to the state of Indiana, I think they could apply broadly to a large number of states that are now grappling with a lot of these same issues, and that are considering now the major expansion of solar power and how they want to ensure that the solar is developed in a sustainable manner. So the first kind of go-to policy recommendation is just for the state itself to develop that pollinator habitat assessment scorecard if it already doesn't have one. So that can be through a state agency, it can be through a university, it can be enshrined in legislation or done outside of that. And then accompanying technical guidance that goes with that is really helpful for developers. And so we heard the great Virginia example about some of the really fantastic tools they're developing to assist not just solar developers, but other folks that are looking to plant native species. And so those guidance documents, those web tools, that's all really helpful and can really complement the habitat assessment scorecard. The next recommendation is for local governments to adopt solar siting guidelines that encourage pollinator-friendly practices. So this can be done through the specific siting requirements. It can be part of conditional use permits that solar facilities typically have to secure in order to build a large-scale project. And these can, again, they can rely on the scorecard or provide additional requirements or direction for developing solar sites that include things like planting native species as ground cover. Utilities and procuring entities can also require information from their prospective developers when they issue RFPs or other solicitations on the pollinator practices, the site management practices, and actively solicit that information. There's lots of utilities right now that are issuing RFPs and are expected to in the coming years. Particularly, we're seeing a lot of integrated resource plans that utilities are working on show solar is extremely cost effective, and so competitive solicitations are really taking off across the country as a way to help customers and ensure that they're getting the lowest cost energy sources. So these RFPs can include a request for information on a site's plan and practices relating to pollinator habitat. They could even require a completion of the applicable pollinator habitat scorecard. And they can even state a preference for projects that meet scorecard's criteria for being pollinator friendly. So these are all examples that utilities could incorporate into that process. And then developers themselves can be proactive in designing and managing solar sites to be pollinator friendly. A couple examples of how they can do that are, one, make sure your panels are at least 36 inches above the ground at their lowest point, and that will allow the native plant growth around and under the panels while minimizing the risk of shading from the plants. Another example is making sure that cabling and wiring between panel arrays are buried, allowing for easy mowing of the vegetation several times a year. There's a lot of other great recommendations and some of the technical guidance that's been prepared. And so our report has a lot of citations and resources to some of these great resources that have been developed across the country from a lot of the pioneers and leaders in this area. And with that, thank you very much. I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Great, thank you, Ben. And yeah, let's turn it over to Dan Shaw in Minnesota. The platform's yours, Dan.
Thank you. It's good to be with all of you today. So I'm Dan Shaw with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. So I'll be talking about the origins of our program, talk about some of the goals, how the program works, and then some of the next steps of different new aspects of the program that we're working on. Back up here. So back in 2013, it was mentioned that we had some legislation. We also had an executive order to focus on pollinators and focus both on their protection and their restoration with plantings. So that started a process of incorporating pollinator habitat into as many project types as we could within the state. And so for our agency, that meant stormwater projects where we're doing rain gardens and other biofiltration areas, larger conservation plantings, agricultural BMPs, and then we've been expanding more recently into urban landscapes with our lawns and legumes program. So planting habitat on solar sites was definitely a good addition to some of the other efforts that we had underway. And Rob mentioned that in 2016, we had legislation that was stating that if a solar developer wanted to claim that the site provided benefits to game birds, songbirds, and pollinators, that they needed to be meeting state standards. And that started our process of developing a standard, essentially a scorecard, for solar developers to be able to claim that they were habitat friendly. Some of our key program goals have been to meet legislative requirements, assist local governments. We have some local governments that have been requiring that any ground-mounted solar be habitat friendly. Stearns County within Minnesota is one group that we've been working closely with that does have that requirement. Providing flexibility in design. We want these sites to be able to have different options as far as how they're laid out and different seed mixes and different options for sites. Maximizing the benefits of projects. Creating consistency across the state has been another goal. We definitely want these projects to be successful, and so we've been doing outreach and refining some of our guidance on habitat-friendly solar to create that consistency across the state, helping to make sure that these projects are successful long-term. So I'll get into some of the key steps for meeting the standard. Back in 2016, our first step was to create a scorecard for the program. And with a scorecard, we had a large group of stakeholders involved thinking about what would need to be on a solar scorecard. This slide lists some of the key aspects that we included on the scorecard. And this one was really focused on project planning. So it was intended to be filled out as projects were being planned, as seed mixes were being developed. And I think overall this has worked pretty well. We did a recent update of this assessment form and our other assessment form just recently, because there were a few revisions that we thought were needed based on what we were seeing on projects. And so we thought after 4.5 or so years, we thought it was time to do an update. Once the form is filled out, we've been doing the review of these forms, but some local government staff are now getting more involved. In particular, conservation districts are getting more involved, and we think that's a really good role for them to be involved with these projects since they know the local conditions, and then they can be involved in site assessments since they're closer to these sites. So that we think that's a really good model moving ahead to have the conservation districts involved. One thing we were noticing as we were reviewing plans is that in many cases, the information that was provided for establishing the native vegetation wasn't as detailed as we would have liked. And so we started developing sample specifications for projects. And this is up on our Habitat Friendly website now. And it's intended to help guide the planners of projects. And it does seem like there's a pretty wide range of staff that get involved on these projects, and their experience with native vegetation can vary. So these are sample specifications intended to give a baseline of information for planners, and they can use this information to adapt their plans as needed. So once projects are reviewed and approved, then they go on to a state list of projects that are meeting our standard. We actually have this list down from our website because we're in the process of updating it, but this list plays a key role in listing all of the projects that are meeting the standard. So once a project is assessed with the project planning form, it can go on to the list. And then we also developed a assessment form for year 3, and then every 3 years for them to stay on that list. Inspections also play a really important role with these projects. Since we have a 3-year assessment form, there isn't necessarily a requirement that inspections are done every year, but we definitely recommend it to make sure that any problems are caught before they become bigger issues. On these sites, invasive plant species, I think, are the biggest risk that we're seeing. Things like Canada thistle, other noxious weeds showing up on these sites can become management issues, and the earlier they're spotted and management is begun, the better to avoid larger problems. And I mentioned that established project form, and this one is set up for assessing projects at year 3. So the things that are being looked at on this assessment form are similar to the project planning form, but it is really focused on what we expect to see once projects are fully established, which we usually consider around year 3 or 4 for these projects, is when the native vegetation is getting to maturity. And so we have this set up so every 3 years the form needs to be refilled out and submitted to stay on the list of approved projects. With these projects going from agriculture in most cases, it's going from a disturbed state, and quite often there's high nutrients. And so probably one of the bigger challenges we've had with these projects is weed growth. But as we've progressed with projects, partners working on them are finding solutions to some of the challenges that they've been finding. Seed mixes are being revised. There is a fair amount of shading underneath the panels, and that's another reason that different seed mixes are being looked at to address the areas of higher shade underneath the panels. And so as we've progressed, we've been finding different strategies that seem to be working pretty well, and our guidance will be changing as we get more and more information about these strategies. We have a What's Working webpage for our agency that we're working on updating, and so we'll be including information about successful strategies for solar projects in addition to our other conservation projects onto that What's Working webpage. So moving ahead, we'll be encouraging counties to be using the standard and addressing their ordinances. We recently had a Habitat Solar Summit to get different stakeholders together from around the state to talk about what's being done with solar projects, what ordinances are being used, and really the goal was to create more consistency around the state with habitat projects. And I mentioned that Stearns County example. We think that model is working well with getting the conservation district involved, with helping to review plans and go out and do site inspections of these projects, since they have expertise to do the site inspections. And so that's one thing that we'll be working on moving ahead, is just working to get greater consistency across the state with ordinances and how counties are working with the program. We have our updated forms, which were just recently updated and posted onto our website. I think we've made some good improvements with the forms. We are providing a lot more information about how to fill out the forms and just assess sites. And so we're trying to get feedback from people who are going through the process of reviewing projects. And so with that new update, I think it'll probably be several years before we make any other changes to the forms. And then increasing site inspections, SWCD involvement, and updating our list of projects will be next steps for the program. Just making sure that we have a complete list of all the projects that are meeting the standard. And we work pretty closely with the Department of Natural Resources on this program as well. It was mentioned about their guidance that they have developed for solar projects. And we're currently working with them on some new seed mixes. We have a few seed mixes that are being used for solar projects, but we're making a few revisions to those mixes to address the shade areas within these sites. It's not advancing to my last slide, but that was the end of the presentation, so we can transition. There we go.
Great. Well, thank you, Dan, and thanks to all our presenters. That was excellent. So we've got about 20 minutes left for Q&A, and we've got a lot of great questions that have come in. We'll get to as many of them as we can. In most cases, I think these are largely directed to you, Rob. So unless otherwise indicated, I'll let you take the first crack, and then if some of our other panelists want to chime in, they can do so. So first question is there analysis of whether the cooling effect provides enough improvement to offset the cost of implementing native plants compared to no maintenance options like gravel? The cooling effect on the panels and increased generation associated with it.
Yeah, the interesting thing about this approach is the opportunity that it unlocks for numerous stacked values. So whether the cooling does or does not positively contribute to efficiency is just one area of value. The other significant area of value is just reduced mowing. The minute you put the panels up at 36 inches and establish and approach a solar development with the goal of one annual mow, you are unleashing kind of a cascading set of benefits. So fewer mowers on site means less labor cost, but it also means significantly less mower to solar contact. So when panels are down low, then there's increased risk of once a year, twice a year, 3 times a year of those mowers clipping solar panels, cracking solar panels. It just doesn't take many broken solar panels to make it incredibly cost effective. And so what we've seen and heard from civil engineers is that the cost of getting from 24 inches up to 36 inches is less than $4,000 per megawatt. So in the overall scope of a project budget, it's what one CFO told me, it's equivalently budget dust. So so a short-term expenditure of some capital, additional capital to raise the panels up, gives you the opportunity to establish that that one time a mow, once mowing just once a year kind of landscape. But the temperature sensitivity is going to be highly dependent on the location and the state. So just for the first time back in this past fall, the National Renewable Energy Lab worked with the University of Arizona, published a study showing a 16-degree cooler microclimate under the panels on a project, a tiny project down in Arizona, leading to an increased efficiency of 2%. On the other end of the spectrum, we know that bare ground and gravel does create a heat island effect around solar farms, which does affect PV life and generation. So somewhere between those two spectrums is pollinator-friendly solar. On one end, you have the transpiration of crops. On the other end, you have the heat island of the gravel. So my bet is that if you go through all of the different values, whether it's reduced mowing, more resilient landscape, and the potential for that efficiency, that you'll see that it's a net winner on economics alone.
Great, thanks, Rob. We've gotten a few questions on carbon sequestration, and are there any projects or plans to quantify carbon sequestration for offset credits? Questions about farmers doing carbon sequestration in soil on the same land as pollinator-friendly solar, or data or evaluation results available on carbon sequestration in soil.
I know that Argonne National Lab is going to be publishing a study this summer that uses the INVEST model for ecosystem services to quantify the carbon sequestration, additional carbon sequestered on pollinator-friendly solar sites versus various other conditions. So I'm not aware of any other opportunities to stack additional values or unlock revenue streams from that. Ben, are you aware of anything like that in terms of carbon generation or sequestered carbon for some kind of an adder or something?
Not off the top of my head, I'm not sure about that.
Okay, great. Well, let's move on to the next question. We've gotten a lot of great questions in. This person says, pretty clear that pollinator-friendly trumps turf and/or stone and/or asphalt. In our state, most of the land being converted would have been in pasture or crops. How should we think about the synergies and trade-offs in these contexts? We have a few questions sort of associated with this topic.
That's great. And I mean, Ben's report does a really good job of highlighting that. You certainly have a lot of pasture and a lot of crops in, and certainly in Virginia as well as in Indiana. You know, every state has specialty crops that are highly pollinator dependent. It's, and then obviously there's a lot of, you know, corn and beans grown everywhere. So corn is not a pollinator dependent crop. Corn pollen does negatively affect solar. You know, corn releases a lot of pollen, and that can cover solar panels. The flowers on pollinator-friendly solar farms, you'll never see that pollen accumulate. It's just not released in a sufficient quantity. But it's been pointed out by several folks in grazing and in beekeeping that a pollinator-friendly solar farm is a great opportunity for basically to create a collaboration with farmers. Beekeepers like to keep their hives outside the fence there because they won't be subject to direct application of insecticides. Grazers, particularly in New England and New York, are really bringing rotational grazing of solar farms to scale. So I think there's more and more opportunities for this kinds of agricultural partnerships. And I just encourage, you know, the developers on the call to you know, to propose pollinator-friendly solar projects from the get-go and include photos and a lot of descriptions about the plants, so that, you know, that the county sees that you're really approaching this intending to embrace best practices.
Great, thank you. What maintenance methods for cleaning ground-mounted solar panels are compatible with pollinator-friendly solar sites?
I guess that's an interesting question. Dan, we haven't seen, I mean, mostly we're just seeing these sites are just there's just traditional maintenance techniques. I mean, people are wearing outdoor appropriate gear, and then the rain is taking care of a lot of the work. The thicker vegetation is actually suppressing a lot of the dust that you might see in some other places. Dan Shaw, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I don't think we've really seen that come up with projects that they're getting in with equipment to clean the panels. It's a good question about whether that's being done in some areas, but yeah, I think with the native vegetation, we're not seeing soil movement, at least within the sites, that would cover the panels. When it comes to the actual maintenance of the sites themselves, you know, there is equipment going in to do maintenance during the first few years as the vegetation establishes, and that is a combination of tractors and handheld mowers to do some of that maintenance. But as far as the cleaning, I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, and just I guess something that occurs to me is there's absolutely no expectation that you know, well, I guess we expect that the site is fully accessible by a pickup truck or you know, four-wheeler or whatever vehicles need to get in and around there. You know, those are one of the key operating conditions of a solar facility, is being able to get everywhere and around on site. So at various times of the year, you know, yes, you might be driving down a row and driving over a whole bunch of flowers, and you know, that's just acknowledging that, you know, that the flowers and the vegetation is playing an important role, but it is a secondary role to, you know, to the operating efficiency of the solar project.
Great, thanks. Next question. How do different kinds of benefits to pollinators, environment, et cetera, vary by scale? Should people think of pollinator friendly in the same way for a 1 megawatt facility as for a 300 megawatt facility? If not, what are the key differences?
Dan has seen a lot of that firsthand. We we have a community solar program here in Minnesota that limits projects at 1 megawatt, which there's a lot of companies that are developing pollinator-friendly solar farms at that scale, and that's at that size. And then we also have a 100 megawatt project, North Star Solar, and a 150 megawatt project, Aurora Solar, that are much larger. And that's, I think, the beauty of the scorecard approach is that it's not about just like what's planted by the front gate. It's about an incremental but meaningful benefit on all the seed mixes. Dan, any perspective on that as well?
Well, I think it's important to note that the different sizes all have potential benefits. Even smaller sites can provide a lot of pollinator benefit. It's similar to the monarch way station idea, where you're providing small areas of habitat which can benefit local species. The really large sites might be providing more bird habitat, or maybe habitat for different bee species that need more larger, more intact areas. So I think with the area, we're seeing benefits no matter what the size is. Sometimes there are benefits of large areas related to protection from pesticide drift if it is surrounded by agriculture. So sometimes the size has influences on the sustainability of sites.
And Rene, I know that there's lots of, certainly the first pollinator-friendly or Pollinator-Smart program project site, the Sun Tribe site in Virginia, is relatively, relatively small in scale. I think it's a couple of megawatts, but it's at an elementary school. But you've got a lot of big projects in the pipeline there in Virginia. Any thoughts?
We do, Rob, and so I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, that some of the research is pointing to as little as half an acre of pollinator habitat can be beneficial to pollinators. So as we're looking certainly at solar and a lot of commercially scaled solar here in Virginia, we're also looking at other opportunities, as I mentioned towards the end of the presentation, beyond solar in transmission lines, in landscaping of parks and so forth. So I think all of it is needed and would be additive for, providing habitat for the pollinators that we're trying to support. But certainly, I think that folks should be thinking, certainly what can I do, even if it's on a smaller scale than even, say, a large commercial solar facility.
Thank you. Next question. This is from a developer. How have folks overcome the issue of needing to utilize herbicides and pesticides to control unwanted grasses or other vegetation? And is this only an issue in wetland areas, or are there non-toxic ways to control unwanted competing vegetation for pollinators, particularly in those areas?
This is Rob. I'll take that first. I don't think any of the scorecards specify a ban on use of integrated vegetation management protocols. So IVM protocols call for a mix of some mowing, some spot spraying, and other strategies to address invasive or non-native or noxious plant species. So there are requirements about invasive and noxious plant management on any kind of development, whether it's solar, whether it's not, whether it's pollinator or not. So having a partner that knows how to recognize noxious or invasive species, the kind of partner that would install a pollinator-friendly solar farm, actually sets you up for a better situation. What I've seen is that there's a lot of developers that just go get a mobid, a low cost, a couple of guys with a couple of pickups and a couple of mowers, who don't necessarily recognize the difference between various plant species. And so they don't know that, a Canadian thistle is about to drop 400,000 seeds. And so they just mow it down, which now they've spread those seeds all around your solar project. And they've tracked those seeds into the wheels of their mower, and they're going to bring them to your next project and the one after that. So there's a variety of different techniques to manage invasives and noxious weeds, but it absolutely starts with expertise. So you want to have a good partner in doing these projects. Dan, you might have had more experience on this as well.
Yeah, I think another thing is the site preparation, making sure that weeds are really controlled beforehand, that there's a clean seed bed that's being seeded into. And I would agree that having contractors that are well qualified is really important. They'll be able to spot things early before they become bigger issues. So even if the plants are only a couple inches tall, they should be able to tell what that species is coming into the site, and so they can deal with it before it becomes a bigger issue. Then it'll save a lot of time and money later on. And we really focus on spot treatment whenever possible. The mowing tends to control a lot of the weeds in the establishment phase of these projects, but we do agree that there needs to be some spot treatment at times of weeds with herbicide. But if that can be localized and done early in the process, then we're avoiding doing more spraying later. And so it really goes back to those frequent site inspections.
Thanks. We've got a couple questions on the practice of solar grazing. People who would like to hear more about it, its compatibility, and are other states recommending this approach, or is the guidance neutral on sheep for grazing in particular?
It's a very interesting, this is Rob, it's an interesting and emerging field. I would say the biggest constraint right now is the location of sheep. So, sheep farmers are not conveniently located within 5 miles of all the substations. And that's obviously where the vast majority of the solar development is going. Sheep don't really like to be in a trailer for more than 2 or 3 hours. But it's, the American Solar Grazing Association, ASGA, has a fantastic set of webinars and training materials on their website. I believe it's just asga.com or maybe asga.org. And they've even come out with a cleverly named Fuzz and Buzz seed mix. The fuzz is obviously for the sheep and the buzz is for the bees. So, and I believe that was developed in collaboration with Ernst Conservation Seeds and Ernst Pollinator Services. So ASGA is a great resource for grazing, and it is definitely, when it's done in a rotational way, a conservation grazing way, then the sheep are not eating the habitat, they're actually improving the quality of the habitat.
Great. Well, we're getting to the end of our allotted time, and we've taken up a good chunk of your time today. Well, I'll end with just one more question here, and then we'll do a closeout. This question, well, I'll do it actually in 2 parts. This question first will be for Rene, and then we turn it over. The second part will be for you, Rob. So, seeds and planting on state property, is this a requirement that's put into Virginia's RFP that native seeds be utilized? And another person asked, notice that there's naturalized plant species in a lot of your pictures in your slides, Rob. So just requirements around native. We'll start with you, Rene.
Sure. So at this point, I'm not aware of there's a requirement. And again, I can't speak across the Commonwealth for all the various agencies and so forth. I know there is encouragement and so forth, and I think that it'll be dependent on individual agencies whether that is a requirement. I know it's something that's highly recommended in terms of the planting of native species when revegetating areas. And we've seen it through various project developments, such as I mentioned, the pipelines and so forth. But in terms of it being an actual requirement, I don't know that I can actually speak to that in terms of the various agencies, both federal and state.
And then when it comes to native versus naturalized, there's a bunch of different jargon here. So I'm going to unpack it a little bit. Native plants are the plants that have typically grown in that area from pre-colonial times, but they are differentiated from native local ecotype plants. And that would mean that the specific plants that have grown within this 150-mile area, of any particular point, the plants that are uniquely attuned to grow there and have been growing there since pre-colonial times. And then there's naturalized and non-invasive naturalized species. Clovers and legumes are included in those. So we have to, I think, embrace the fact that that this is a managed landscape. A solar farm is a managed landscape. And there is a degree of romanticism about prairie restoration. I'm, an Eagle Scout myself, and I spent many a beautiful camping trip out on Minnesota's remnant prairies, hiking them and really taking in the wind and the sun and the sky. But that's not what we're doing here. We're not going to plant big blue stem, 6-foot tall prairie grass under and around a solar facility. So these are managed landscapes, and so it's compromising. We're acknowledging that to make a meaningful benefit for bees, we are already, in many cases, replacing, the many acres of corn that was likely heavily treated with neonicotinoid insecticides. So it is a meaningful benefit just to kind of stop the harm that those insecticides were causing to local bee populations or honeybee populations. And then there's an opportunity to actually make an improvement. And that can be in a naturalized set of seed mixes. Usually there's one array mix and then a other mix that's an open area mix. And the open area mix might be a little taller than the array mix. The Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund and Conservation Blueprint have done a really good job partnering with the U.S. Geological Survey to design seed mixtures that actually show native pollinators in many cases, or in some cases at least, respond to and benefit more from from naturalized seed mixtures. So we have to, I think, just acknowledge that we can do something better, and we don't have to make the perfect the enemy of meaningful improvement. And that's a really important principle that I think we can all take away. And the reason that this approach is seeing such bipartisan support, whether it's pheasant hunters or monarch lovers, is that there's just a lot of enthusiasm and excitement for the operational and efficiency benefits of pollinator-friendly solar.
Great. Thanks, Rob. That's a great note to end on. And I do want to thank all our presenters for those great presentations. We managed to fill up an hour and a half very quickly. That went by. I also want to thank our audience for the great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but there's a lot of good ones, and appreciate you tuning in. I'm going to now turn it back to Samantha to close out.
Great. Thank you, Nate, and thank you to everyone who attended and to all of our speakers. So before you leave today, I just want to let you know that we do have a number of webinars coming up. You can see those webinars listed on your screen. There is more information about those on our website at cesa.org/webinars. All of these webinars are free and open to the public, and they should be great. So we hope that you can attend. Again, thank you for coming today, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Bye, everyone.